My husband ordered me to apologize to his cruel family at Thanksgiving or leave forever. So I grabbed my son, boarded a one-way flight, and vanished without a single goodbye. The flight attendant handed me coffee. My hand didn't shake. That surprised me. 8 hours earlier, I'd been standing in my mother-in-law's dining room while everyone I loved took turns tearing me apart. Now I was 40,000 feet over the Atlantic with my 3-year-old son asleep against my chest. I felt nothing but quiet. The cabin lights had dimmed for the overnight leg. Somewhere behind me, a baby fussed and settled. Milo's weight against my collarbone was warm and total, the specific dead-weight sleep of a toddler who has no idea his whole life just changed shape while he wasn't looking. I could still smell Diane's kitchen on my coat, sage, roasted turkey, the candle she only ever burned in November, and underneath it, faintly, the wine Grant had been drinking when he told me to apologize or leave. "Say you're sorry," Grant had said, "or pack your things and leave." He said it in front of his mother, his brother, his sister-in-law, and their 10-year-old daughter. He said it the way you'd order a side dish, like it cost him nothing. His mother, Diane, lifted her wine glass a half-inch off the table, like she was toasting something. Her son Brett didn't look up from his plate. Brett's wife, Holly, gave me the tight little smile of a woman relieved it wasn't her turn. Their daughter, Piper, watched me the way she'd been taught to, like I was the family's cautionary tale. I looked at my son, Milo, asleep on the couch in the next room, thumb near his mouth, oblivious to all of it. Then I looked back at my husband of 8 years and said the only word I had left for him. Okay. I watched something in Grant's face loosen. Relief. He thought I'd broken. His mother sipped her wine like she'd won a small, satisfying war. I smiled, said I needed air, and walked out to my car in the cold. I didn't cry in the driveway. I hadn't cried in 11 months. I drove home alone while Grant stayed at his mother's house to let me calm down. And at 3:30 that morning, I lifted my sleeping son out of his bed for the last time in that house. By 5, we were through security at Wilmington International. By 6, we were in the air, connecting through Newark and then Lisbon, on 2 one-way tickets I'd bought 4 days earlier and paid for in cash withdrawals small enough not to trip a bank alert. I know how those alerts work. It's my job to know. People think the loud part is the scary part, the yelling, the slammed door, the ultimatum delivered in front of an audience. It isn't. The loud part is just the fuse. The real moment is silent. It's a woman in seat 14C, watching black water pass beneath her, already certain of exactly what she's going to do the second the plane lands. I'm Vanessa Cardoso Whitfield. I read numbers for a living. I'm a compliance analyst at a regional bank in Wilmington called Cape Fear Trust. I flag transactions that don't add up. I notice small inconsistencies before they become large ones. I keep records the way other people breathe, automatically without being asked. Remember that. It matters later. My father, Walter, spent 30 years as a staff accountant for a textile company in Charlotte before it closed, and he used to tell me when I was small enough to sit on his lap while he balanced a checkbook by hand that a number never lies, but people around a number lie constantly, and your job is just to follow the number until it tells you the truth on its own. I built an entire career out of that sentence. It took me considerably longer to apply it to my own marriage. I married Grant Whitfield 8 years ago, in June, at a garden venue off Airlie Road that Diane insisted on paying for so she could insist on the guest list too. Grant was 36 now, a senior associate at a wealth management firm downtown called Aldridge Sterling Partners, the kind of firm where men in blue suits told other men where to put their inheritances. He was warm where I was careful. That was the whole equation in the beginning. He softened the edges Diane said I had. "She's got a hardness around the eyes," Diane told him the first time we met, at a lunch in April 2017, loud enough for me to hear across the table, like I was a piece of furniture being appraised. Grant laughed it off. "She's just direct, Mom," he said, and I told myself that was the end of it. I told myself she'd warm up eventually. She didn't warm up. She sharpened. At our rehearsal dinner that June, Diane stood up with a glass of Prosecco and gave a toast that started sweet and ended with a blade in it. "Grant has always been generous to a fault," she said, smiling at the room. "I just hope he's not the only generous one in this marriage." 40 people laughed politely. I laughed too, because that's what you do at your own rehearsal dinner. I didn't understand yet that she'd just told me in front of witnesses exactly what she thought of me and exactly what she planned to keep track of. Grant's older brother Brett, 39, worked in commercial real estate and treated most conversations like negotiations he intended to win. His wife Holly, 37, had married into the family 2 years before me and had clearly decided the safest position was to never be the one Diane was frowning at. Their daughter Piper was 10 now, sharp and observant in the way children are when they've spent their whole lives reading a room for who's in trouble. Our first Thanksgiving as a married couple, in November of 2017, Diane assigned me the entire meal without asking, then spent the afternoon in the living room with the rest of the family while I stood alone at her stove, working from recipe cards in her handwriting, listening to laughter I wasn't part of drifting in from the next room. When I finally sat down to eat, she told the table cheerfully that it was so nice to finally have some help around here. Grant laughed along with everyone else. I told myself it was a one-time thing, a new daughter-in-law hazing I'd age out of. I didn't understand yet that it wasn't a hazing. It was an assignment, and I just accepted the position permanently. We bought our house that same year, a 3-bedroom on Kerr Avenue with a wraparound porch, financed almost entirely on Grant's income because I was 2 years into my role at Cape Fear Trust and still building my own credit history. I didn't think much of of that imbalance at the time. It would matter more later, when the paperwork on that house turned out to have my name on things I'd never actually signed. 2 years into our marriage, in the spring of 2019, our kitchen flooded after a pipe burst under the sink, and Diane offered us $15,000 to redo it before we could even call our insurance. I said no. Grant said yes before I'd finished the sentence. "It's just mom being mom," he told me. "She likes to help." She did like to help. She liked it the way a bank likes issuing a loan, because it comes with terms nobody wrote down but everybody was expected to honor. For the next 5 years, that $15,000 came up constantly, at holidays, at arguments that had nothing to do with money. "After everything we've done for this family," Diane would say, and I'd watch Grant's shoulders curl inward, and I'd understand that the debt was never really about the kitchen. It was about who got to be the one everyone owed. In the fall of 2021, when Milo was 6 months old, I tried to close the account, so to speak. I'd saved enough on my own to write Diane a check for the full $15,000, plus what I calculated as a fair amount of interest, and I handed it to her at her kitchen table with Grant standing behind me, silent, the way he always stood behind me at that table. Diane looked at the check for a long moment and then set it down without picking it up. "This isn't about the money, Vanessa," she said, in a voice that suggested I deeply misunderstood something obvious. "I don't need to be paid back. I just need you both to remember what family does for each other." She never cashed it. I found it 4 years later, in a drawer in her house, still folded along the same crease, the ink barely faded. She hadn't wanted the money at all. She'd wanted the debt to stay open forever, because an open debt is a leash, and a closed one is just a receipt. Milo was born in the spring of 2021. Diane's first comment in the hospital room, 20 minutes after I delivered him, was that I looked pale and should really consider formula so I could get some rest and get back to yourself. I was holding my son. I hadn't slept in 30 hours. I said nothing. Grant said nothing either. That was the pattern, if I'm honest with myself now. Not once in 8 years did he tell his mother to stop. Not once did he step between us. He just went quiet and waited for it to pass over him, the way you wait out weather. 6 weeks later, at Milo's first pediatrician appointment, Diane showed up uninvited, having called the office herself to find the date, and spent the visit correcting me in front of the doctor about swaddling techniques she'd read about somewhere online. When I asked her gently to let me handle Milo's medical care myself, she teared up in the waiting room and told Grant, later that night, that I was cutting her out of her only grandson's life. Grant asked me, not unkindly, if I could try to be a little more patient with her. I remember thinking, even then, that patience was the one resource in our marriage that only ever flowed in a single direction. I loved him anyway. That's the part people skip when they tell these stories, the part that makes it sound simple. It wasn't simple. He was gentle with Milo. He remembered the small things, my coffee order, the anniversary of my grandmother's death, the fact that I hated surprise parties. For years, I believed the man I saw in our kitchen on a Tuesday night was more real than the man who went silent at his mother's table. I was wrong about which one was load-bearing. The money started disappearing in February of last year. $3,000 gone from our joint savings account in a single transfer I hadn't authorized. I brought it up over dinner, casual, the way you'd mention a strange charge on a card. Grant barely looked up from his phone. "It's a sweep account thing," he said. "The bank moves it around for interest optimization. It's fine." "Since when do we have a sweep account?" I asked. "Since I set one up," he said. "You'd know if you read the statements instead of just glancing at the app. It was a small cut, the kind designed to make the person holding the question feel like the negligent one." I let it land. He worked in finance. I believed him because believing him was easier than the alternative, and because for 6 years he'd given me no specific reason not to. By May, it was worse. $48,000. Our entire savings, the number I'd watched build for 6 years, one direct deposit at a time, had dropped to $340. I found it on a Sunday morning, scrolling through the account on my phone while Milo watched cartoons beside me. I felt the floor tilt. I showed Grant the screen. "Don't freak out," he said, before I'd said a single word, which is its own kind of confession if you know how to read it. "The market dipped hard in April. It'll come back." I asked which account. He said a diversified fund, said it in the tone he used with clients who didn't understand the difference between a bond and a stock, a tone designed to end a conversation rather than continue one. "Show me the fund," I said. "Just the name of it. That's all I want. I'll pull it up this weekend," he said. I'm not doing this right now in front of him, meaning Milo, who was 3 feet away, singing along to a cartoon theme song and understanding none of it. The weekend came and went. So did the next one. I let it end. That's on me. I want to be honest about that. I had built an entire career on the principle that you follow a number until it explains itself. And at home, with the person I loved, I let a $48,000 hole go unexplained for months because asking again felt like an accusation I wasn't ready to make out loud. In July, my father Walter called me from Charlotte, his voice careful in a way I didn't recognize. "I want you to know the $10,000 is just between us," he said. Grant explained the situation. "I trust you both." I had no idea what $10,000 he meant. I sat with the phone against my ear and did the math in half a second. Grant had borrowed money from my own father and told him I already knew. I didn't correct my father. I couldn't. The idea of him finding out his son-in-law had lied to his face, using my name as collateral for the lie, was worse to me in that moment than carrying the lie myself. "Of course," I said. "Thank you, Dad." I hung up and sat in my car in the the driveway for 11 minutes before I could make myself walk inside. In early August, I made a mistake I understood the full weight of only in hindsight. Holly and I had gone for a walk along the river walk downtown, just the two of us, the closest thing to a friendship I'd managed to build inside that family, and I told her, quietly, that I was worried about Grant. Not the specifics. I didn't have the specifics yet, not fully, just that money seemed to be disappearing and he wouldn't explain where. Holly nodded along, sympathetic, said all the right things. 10 days later, at a birthday dinner for Piper, Diane leaned across the table and said, apropos of nothing, I hear you've been worried about money, Vanessa. Grant works so hard for this family. It must be hard for him, being doubted like that. The words were close enough to my own, said to Holly in confidence, that there was no other explanation. Holly wouldn't meet my eyes for the rest of the meal. I understood, watching her study her plate, that there was no version of that family where a private conversation stayed private, and no version of me that Diane wouldn't eventually use as evidence against me, even when the evidence came out of my own mouth. I stopped confiding in anyone after that. Not Holly, not Brett, not even Grant, not really. It's a specific kind of loneliness, being surrounded by a family at every holiday and trusting none of them with a single true thing. I told myself it was temporary, that I was just being careful during a rough patch. I didn't yet have the language for what it actually was, which was isolation, built slowly enough that I mistook it for my own choice. Diane's next move came dressed as generosity, the way most of her moves did. In mid-August, at a Sunday lunch, she announced, unprompted, that she wanted to pay for Milo's spot at a private preschool downtown starting the following fall, a school with a $9,000 tuition and a wait list. Diane claimed to have already gotten him onto through a friend on the board. I said we'd think about it. Grant said yes on our behalf, again, before I'd finished my sentence, again. 2 weeks later, after I'd pushed back at dinner about a comment Diane made regarding my work hours, she brought the preschool up again, this time phrased differently. I just don't know if I can commit to that tuition, she said, looking at Grant instead of me, if things at home are going to keep being this tense. It wasn't subtle. It was never actually subtle. Once I started looking for the shape of it, comply or the help disappears. And the help disappearing will look, to everyone watching, like my fault, rather than hers. I told Grant that night I didn't want Milo's schooling tied to his grandmother's moods. Grant told me I was reading too much into a generous offer. I let that one go too, filed alongside all the others, because by then filing things quietly had become the only form of resistance I had left. Diane had one more tool, and she used it that same month. Her husband Richard had died of a heart attack 11 years earlier, 2 years before I met the family, and she referenced his death constantly, in ways that always seemed to arrive exactly when she needed the room to soften around her. That August, after I'd gently pushed back on something at a family dinner, I don't even remember what, some small thing about Milo's bedtime, Diane pressed a hand to her chest and said her doctor had warned her about stress affecting her blood pressure, that arguing like this wasn't good for a widow raising 2 grown sons alone. Grant was at her side within seconds, refilling her water, asking if she needed her pills. The argument, whatever it had been about, evaporated instantly, replaced by everyone's urgent concern for Diane's heart. I watched Grant's hand on his mother's shoulder and understood, with a clarity that scared me a little, that I would never be able to out-argue a woman who could end any conversation simply by invoking her own mortality. I checked quietly, months later, whether Diane had actually been to a cardiologist that year. She hadn't. Her general practitioner's office, when Vivian eventually subpoenaed basic records as part of establishing a pattern for the custody filing, showed a single routine physical in October with unremarkable results. I don't say that to mock a woman's health. I say it because it was one more entry in a growing ledger, one more place where the story being told didn't match the numbers underneath it, and by then I'd learned to trust the numbers over the story every single time. By September, I'd started keeping a folder, not because I'd decided anything yet, because it's what I do. I photograph statements, I timestamp screenshots. It's reflex, the same reflex that makes me good at my job. I notice when numbers don't match the story being told about them, and I write down the discrepancy before I understand what it means. What I found in October was the thing that ended the guessing. A letter came in the mail from a lender I didn't recognize, addressed to both of us, referencing a home equity line of credit for $40,000, opened against our house in August. I called the lender's number on the letter, gave my information, and asked a loan officer named Priya to confirm the date the account had been opened and whose signatures were on file. Both signatures were provided at closing, she said. Yours and your husband's, notarized on August the 9th. I hadn't signed anything on August the 9th. I hadn't been in the state on August the 9th. I'd been in Charlotte with Milo, visiting my father, the same trip where he'd thanked me for understanding about the $10,000. I sat in the parking garage outside my office building afterward and called a family law attorney a co-worker had once mentioned in passing, a woman named Vivian Marsh. My voice shook on the phone for the first time in 11 months. I think my husband forged my signature on a loan, I told her. She didn't sound surprised. She sounded like she'd heard the sentence before, from other women, in other parking garages. Breathe, she said. You're not crazy. Now let's get to work. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories and better audio quality. Now back to the video. I didn't scream at Grant. I didn't confront him across a kitchen island like people do in movies. I went quiet instead, the specific kind of quiet that I now recognize as the most dangerous glamorous thing about me. Vivian's first piece of advice was simple. We act, she said. We never react. Reacting tells them you're still deciding. Acting means you already have. She told me in that first meeting, sitting across a small conference table with a legal pad between us, that the women who came to her office angry rarely won anything. Not because anger was unjustified, but because anger is loud and loud things get anticipated. The ones who win, she said, are the ones who keep smiling at dinner while their lawyer is already 3 steps ahead in a courthouse. The husband hasn't thought to check yet. I wrote that down, word for word, in the same notebook where I'd started logging every missing dollar. I read it back to myself more times over the following 11 months than I could count, usually right before a family dinner where I needed my face to say nothing at all about what I already knew. I hired a forensic accountant named Owen Reyes, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who worked out of a small office near the courthouse, and who, within 3 weeks, had traced our savings account through 14 months of transfers into 2 brokerage accounts that had never once shown a gain. Grant hadn't lost money to a market dip. He'd been feeding a personal trading account that bled out, month after month, a red line that only ever pointed one direction. $48,000 gone into options trades that Owen described to me, gently, as structurally almost guaranteed to lose. I hired a document examiner named Renata Ibarra, who specialized in exactly the kind of thing I needed examined. She compared the notarized signature on the HELOC paperwork to 6 samples of my actual signature, going back 9 years, and produced a report with a conclusion so clinical it almost hurt less than the plain truth would have. The signature on the loan documents, she wrote, exhibited consistent structural deviations inconsistent with genuine authorship, most notably in the formation of the capital FIV and the terminal flourish, and was assessed with high confidence to be a traced or freehand simulation rather than an authentic signature. He'd practiced my handwriting. At some point, in some room I hadn't been in, my husband had sat with a sample of my signature and copied it until it was close enough to pass a notary who wasn't looking hard. Owen's final report ran to 11 pages, most of them spreadsheets, and he walked me through it in person. In his small office near the courthouse, a space desk lamp and 2 chairs and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. He'd highlighted the pattern in yellow, a transfer out of savings on the 3rd or 4th of each month, always under $5,000, small enough that no automated flag at the bank would catch it, routed into a brokerage account under Grant's name alone, and opened, Owen pointed out, only 6 weeks after Milo was born. People don't usually start something like this out of nowhere, Owen said, tapping the date on the screen. Something changes. A pressure gets applied somewhere else, and this is where it leaks out. I didn't ask him to speculate further. I already had a guess, and the guess had a fruit bowl and a business card underneath it. I sat in my car afterward with the printed report on the passenger seat and did something I hadn't done in 11 months. I cried once, hard, for about 90 seconds, not for the money, but for the specific, precise cruelty of the timing, that whatever had driven Grant to start bleeding our savings into a doomed trading account had started around the same weeks I was learning to function on 3 hours of sleep with a newborn. The same weeks Diane had stood in my hospital room and told me I looked pale. Then I wiped my face, put the car in drive, and went to pick up Milo from daycare, because that was also, by then, a kind of reflex. Grieve on a schedule, function on a schedule, keep the 2 separated so neither one swallowed the other. Vivian filed an emergency motion in early November, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, requesting temporary sole physical custody of Milo, based on the financial instability and deception documented in Owen's and Renata's reports, along with a declaration from me describing a pattern of coercive financial control. Because of the nature of the filing, and because Vivian was concerned about retaliation once Grant learned what I'd found, the order was granted under a temporary seal, meaning it existed, signed by a judge, before Grant had any idea I'd stopped believing him. I want to be honest about something. Even after all of that, after Owen's report, after Renata's report, after Vivian's filing sat quietly in a courthouse file with my name on it, I still went to Thanksgiving. Some part of me, even then, wanted one more data point. I wanted to see, one more time, whether the family I'd spent 8 years trying to belong to had anything gentler in them than what I'd already cataloged. I went to Diane's house on Landfall Drive at 2 in the afternoon on the 4th Thursday of November, carrying a green bean casserole I didn't want to make with my son's hand in mine, already knowing more than every single person at that table. Diane's house smelled the way it always did on that day, sage and roasting turkey, and the artificial pine of a candle she only ever lit in November. There were more people there than usual that year. An aunt of Grant's named Carol, who drove up from Myrtle Beach, a great uncle who fell asleep in the recliner before the food was even served, 2 cousins in their 20s who spent most of the afternoon on their phones. It struck me later, once I understood what that dinner actually was, that a bigger audience wasn't an accident either. A scripted scene plays differently with more witnesses in the room, and Diane had never once done anything at that table without an audience in mind. Milo ran ran straight for the fenced-in yard, chasing Diane's aging beagle around a maple tree that hadn't finished dropping its leaves yet, and for about 20 minutes, watching him laugh through the window, I let myself believe the day might just pass the way ordinary Thanksgivings pass, boring and slightly too long and over by 8. I noticed things that day that I hadn't let myself notice in years because I was finally looking for them instead of looking away. I noticed that Diane had insisted for the first time in 5 years that Thanksgiving be held at her house instead of rotating to ours or Brett and Holly's, the way it usually did. I noticed a business card on her kitchen counter, tucked half under a fruit bowl. Preston Kellerman, attorney at law, family and estate matters, and thought nothing of it at the time, the way you don't think anything of a stray thread until the sweater unravels. I noticed Grant checking his phone in the hallway outside the bathroom, his voice low, saying something I only caught the tail end of. Before Reyes finishes, we don't have that long. Before he saw me and hung up, too fast, his face rearranging itself into something neutral. I didn't know yet what any of it meant. I only knew, the way I know when a ledger is off by a number too small for anyone else to notice, that something underneath that dinner didn't match the story being told about it. Diane started in before the turkey was even carved. Still dropping Milo at daycare every day, she said, cutting her green beans into precise little segments. A boy needs his mother, not strangers. I said Milo loved his daycare, that his teacher Ms. Alvarez had taught him to count in Spanish, that he was thriving. Diane smiled the smile of a woman who'd already decided the conversation wasn't really about daycare. I just think, she said, some women put themselves first. I stayed calm. I'd been staying calm for 11 months by then. I'd built the calm the way you build a callus, through repeated, deliberate pressure until the skin stops registering the pain the way it used to. Brett brought up my job next, the way he always did. Like my career was a hobby he found charming. Still doing the numbers thing? He asked. And Holly laughed a little too quickly, and Piper watched me from across the table with an expression I recognized because I'd worn it myself once, as a kid at family dinners where the wrong word could shift the whole temperature of the room. Grant said almost nothing through the meal, which had also become its own kind of pattern. He ate. He nodded at his mother's comments. He refilled his wine twice. Then, near the end of dinner, Diane brought up money. Not directly, never directly, but in the shape of a story about how she'd had to bail Grant and me out of that whole kitchen situation years ago. How family takes care of family. How she just wished that generosity was appreciated instead of resented. Something in me, some last, worn-down piece of patience, finally said, quietly, I think we've paid that back many times over, Diane, in ways you don't seem to count. The table went silent. Grant's fork hit his plate, hard, the sound of it sharper than it should have been for a piece of stainless steel touching china. Say you're sorry, he said, or pack your things and leave. I looked at my son, asleep on the living room couch through the doorway, one small fist curled near his face, and I understood in the space of about 4 seconds that this was the moment. Not a moment I was choosing. A moment that had already been chosen for me, months earlier, by people who thought I hadn't noticed yet. Okay, I said. Diane raised her wine glass a half inch, like a toast to a war she believed she'd already won. Grant exhaled visibly, the exhale of a man who thought the hard part was over. I excused myself, said I needed air, and walked out to my car alone in the cold. I drove home. Grant stayed at Diane's to let me calm down, which was, I understood later, exactly what someone had needed me to do. Leave first, and leave visibly, so that the story of that night would already be written before anyone else got a chance to write it. At 3:30 in the morning, I lifted my sleeping son out of his bed for the last time in that house. I'd had 2 suitcases packed and hidden in the crawl space above our garage for 11 months, since the week I first called Vivian. My mother, Inez Cardoso, had been born in Porto and had made sure before I could walk that I held Portuguese citizenship alongside my American one. So you always have a door, she used to tell me, tucking that blue passport into a drawer I wasn't allowed to touch as a child, like it was a spare key to a house I hadn't built yet. By 5, we were through security. By 6, we were in the air, and I had exactly one thing left to do. 4 days earlier, I'd written and saved a draft email I hadn't sent yet, to Vivian, to Owen, to my father, and, separately, to Grant. Attached to it, Owen's forensic report, Renata's signature analysis, the sealed emergency custody order Vivian had already secured, and one more file. An audio recording taken that very night at dinner on a small voice recorder Vivian had given me weeks earlier and told me to keep in my cardigan pocket just in case, a recording I hadn't fully listened to yet. Somewhere over open water, with Milo's breathing slow and even against my shoulder, I put in my earbuds and opened the file. I'd meant to listen to the whole thing in order, start to finish, the way Owen had taught me to read a statement, chronologically, without skipping ahead to the conclusion, but my thumb kept sliding toward the middle, toward the part I already knew by heart because I'd lived it, the fork against the plate, the 4 words that had ended my marriage in front of witnesses. I made myself go back to the beginning instead. I made myself listen the way I'd trained myself to read a ledger, in order, patiently, because the anomaly is never in the part you already expect. It's in the part you almost skip. Under the noise of the table, under Diane's laughter and the scrape of silverware, there was a stretch of quiet from earlier in the evening, the sound of the kitchen before dinner was served, before I'd walked in with the casserole. I'd apparently set the recorder running in my cardigan pocket the moment I stepped out of the car, the way Vivian had instructed, and hung the cardigan on a hook by Diane's back door while I helped carry dishes in from the porch. stretch. I almost skipped past that stretch. Something made me stop. I heard Diane's voice. Low, urgent, a register I'd never heard her use in 8 years of knowing her. You have to make her leave first, tonight, she was saying, before Reyes finishes that report. If she walks out on her own in front of witnesses, it's abandonment. Abandonment cases don't split the house down the middle, Grant. If you throw her out yourself, it looks bad for you the second this custody thing goes in front of a judge. She has to be the one who leaves. There was a pause. Ice against a glass. Then my husband's voice. 4 words. Quiet enough that I understood immediately why I'd never registered it live. Sitting at that table, distracted by my own effort to stay calm. Whatever you need, Mom. I sat with that for a long time. 31,000 feet over black water. My son asleep against me, understanding all at once that the ultimatum hadn't been Grant's fury boiling over after 8 years of me being difficult. It had been a script, written by his mother in her own kitchen, less than 20 minutes before I walked in with a casserole I didn't want to make. Time to land on a night when she'd already engineered the location, the audience, and the exit. Grant hadn't lost his temper. He'd followed an instruction. I played it again, and then a third time, listening for anything I might have misheard, some detail that would make it smaller than it sounded. There wasn't one. I understood, on the third listen, why Diane had insisted Thanksgiving be at her house that year for the first time since 2020. Why the card for a family law attorney had been sitting under a fruit bowl, where anyone might glance at it and think nothing of it. Why Grant had been on the phone in the hallway saying something about Owen Reyes not having that long. They hadn't known the exact contents of Owen's report. They'd known enough to be afraid of it, and afraid enough to move first. The forgery, I realized, hadn't been a single reckless afternoon. It had been the opening move in a plan that assumed, correctly for 14 months, that I would keep absorbing things quietly rather than ever checking the math. I let the recording run forward into the dinner itself, into Diane's comment about daycare, into Brett's comment about my job, into the exact sound of my own voice saying, I think we've paid that back many times over, Diane, in ways you don't seem to count. Hearing it played back, I noticed something I hadn't caught live. A half-second pause before Grant's fork hit the plate, a pause just long enough for a man following a cue rather than losing his temper. It wasn't rage, it was timing. I hit send anyway. Then I sat with my thumb hovering over the recording for another moment, and I finally understood something else. That for 8 years, I had been arguing with the wrong person in every single fight because the fights were never really coming from him. The email landed on 5 phones at roughly the same moment, 4 in the morning Eastern time, while I was still somewhere over the ocean with no signal to know it had gone through. Vivian later told me she was awake anyway, working a different case, and that she read Owen's report, Renata's analysis, and the transcript of Diane's voice in real time, at her kitchen table, with her coffee going cold. My father called Vivian's office within the hour, then flew to Charlotte's airport at 7 a.m. to catch the earliest connection he could find to Lisbon, telling my stepmother only that he needed to go be somewhere for Vanessa. Grant read the email standing in his mother's guest bedroom, according to what Brett told me much later, and didn't speak for almost 10 minutes. Diane, Brett said, read it over Grant's shoulder and said one sentence before she left the room. This isn't as bad as it sounds. Grant landed in Lisbon 5 days after I did. He came with Brett, not Diane. Brett had insisted on coming, he told me afterward, because some part of him needed to see with his own eyes whether what he'd read in that email could possibly be true, and some smaller part of him, he admitted, still hoped I'd exaggerated. He wanted to believe his brother had made one very bad decision, not a series of small deliberate ones stretched across 14 months. We met at a cafe near my mother's apartment in the Alfama district, tables spilling out onto worn cobblestone, the kind of place where nobody looks twice at raised voices because half the city seems to be having one argument or another at any given hour. My mother sat 2 tables away with Milo, close enough to reach him, far enough to give me room. My father landed that same morning, 4 hours ahead of schedule due to a tailwind, and walked up the street just as Grant and Brett were sitting down. Walter didn't say much. He'd never been a man of many words in a crisis. He pulled out the chair beside me, sat down, and looked at Grant across the table with an expression I'd never seen him wear in 12 years of knowing my husband. Not anger exactly, something closer to the flat, patient look of a man doing an inventory. $10,000, he said once quietly, before anyone else had spoken. Grant's eyes dropped to the table. Nobody needed the sentence finished. Grant looked smaller than I remembered him, tired in a way that made him look older than 36. Vanessa, he said, we can fix this. Whatever this looks like, it's not, I wasn't trying to hurt you. He said it like a man still hoping the story could be rewritten if he found the right sentence quickly enough. Which part isn't what it looks like? I asked. The signature Renata says was traced, the trading account Owen tracked for 14 months, or the recording? He flinched at the word recording in a way that told me, more clearly than anything else that morning, that he hadn't yet worked out I actually had it. Whatever your mother told you, I started to say, and stopped myself, because that wasn't a slip. That was the whole case laid out in 6 words. Grant heard it too. I watched him hear it. You forged my signature, I said. Twice, if you count practicing it beforehand. My voice didn't shake. 11 months of practice had made sure of that. You told my father I already knew about a loan I'd never heard of. You let your mother watch me get picked apart at every holiday for 8 years, and you never once said a word. I let that sit. Brett's jaw tightened beside him. And 2 weeks ago, in your mother's kitchen, 20 minutes before I walked walked in with a casserole. She told you to make me leave first, so it would look like abandonment instead of what it actually was. And you said, and I quote, "Whatever you need, Mom." I watched Brett's face change in real time. The way a person's expression shifts when a floor they'd been standing on their whole life turns out to be a stage set. "What is she talking about, Grant?" he said quietly, and Grant didn't answer, which was itself an answer. His phone rang on the table between us. Diane's name lit up the screen. Grant, on reflex, answered it and put it on speaker without thinking, the way you do when you've spent your whole life letting your mother's voice fill every silence in the room. "Tell her the accounts got frozen because of her," Diane's voice said, tinny and fast, before she'd even confirmed who was listening. "Tell her the bank flagged it because of something she did. Tell her—" Brett reached over and ended the call himself. He didn't look at his mother's name on the screen again. He looked at me instead, something unfamiliar moving across his face. Not quite shame, not quite grief, something closer to a man recalculating every memory he owned. 8 years, he said, mostly to himself. 8 years and I never once. He didn't finish that sentence either. He didn't need to. My father spoke for the first time since he'd sat down. "You told me she already knew," he said to Grant evenly. No theatrics in it, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd shouted. "You looked me in the eye at my own kitchen table and you told me my daughter already knew about that money." Grant opened his mouth and then closed it again, because there was nothing in the sentence he could argue with. "I said the thing I'd been carrying, in one form or another, for 11 months, and I said it plainly, the way you'd read a verdict rather than deliver one. I'm not the one who owes anyone an apology," I told Grant. "I already left. Everything else from here is just paperwork." He reached for my hand across the table, an old reflex, the kind of gesture that had worked on me 100 times over 8 years. I let him touch my fingers for exactly 1 second before I pulled my hand back. "I'm not doing that anymore," I said. "Not the version where I comfort you through the consequences of what you did to me." Then I stood up, walked 2 tables over, and picked up my son. What came after was slower than the ending of a marriage should feel, and it moved in every direction at once. Brett flew home and, within a week, told his mother directly that he wouldn't be part of whatever she was doing anymore. The first time in 39 years, he told me later, that he'd said no to her about anything that mattered. He described the conversation to me afterward, almost apologetically, like he was still surprised at his own nerve. He'd sat Diane down at her kitchen table, the same table, and told her that he'd heard the recording enough times now that he couldn't unhear it, that whatever she thought she'd been protecting by scripting that dinner, she'd done it by using her own son as a prop and lying to a woman who'd never done anything to deserve 14 months of coordinated deception. Diane, he said, told him he was being dramatic, that he'd always taken my side, which wasn't true and had never been true, and which told him everything about how she processed being told no. Holly reached out to me privately through a message a few days after that, careful and short, saying she was sorry, saying she'd known some of it and stayed quiet because staying quiet had always felt safer than the alternative, saying she hoped I understood that Piper had never learned to see me clearly because nobody around her had ever modeled it. She told me in a second message a few weeks later about a specific afternoon I hadn't known about. Diane, back in the spring, asking Holly directly whether she thought I'd actually leave if pushed hard enough, and Holly telling her she didn't know, and Diane saying, "Well, we're going to find out." I read that message on my mother's balcony and sat very still for a long time. I believed Holly. I didn't fully forgive her yet, but I believed her, and over the following months, in small, careful increments, something like trust started to rebuild itself between us, mostly through photos of Milo and Piper that she sent unprompted, no agenda attached, just a woman trying to keep a thread open across an ocean and a broken family. Diane did not go quietly. She hired the attorney whose card I'd noticed under the fruit bowl, Preston Kellerman, and filed for grandparent visitation rights before the divorce paperwork had even been fully served, arguing in a petition that I was alienating Milo from his paternal family. Vivian read the filing and laughed once without humor. "She's suing you," Vivian said, "for the consequences of her own plan working exactly as she designed it." The petition went nowhere. North Carolina courts don't grant grandparent visitation over a fit parent's objection absent extraordinary circumstances, and Owen's report, entered into the family court record, made it very clear whose circumstances were extraordinary and why. Preston Kellerman withdrew from representing her 3 months later, according to Brett, after Diane missed 2 invoices and blamed him, in an email he apparently forwarded to Brett out of sheer disbelief, for not fighting hard enough for her own grandson. She also posted about it. A long message to a family Facebook group that included cousins I'd met twice, and an aunt of Grant's I'd never met at all, describing herself as a grandmother cruelly cut off from a child she loved, without once mentioning forgery, or fraud, or the recording, or the word abandonment she'd once used so precisely in her own kitchen. Piper found that post before her parents did, and according to Holly, asked her mother directly whether Grandma Diane had done something bad. Holly told her the truth, in language a 10-year-old could hold on to, that sometimes grown-ups try to make other people look like the problem so nobody looks too closely at them. Piper wrote me a card that Christmas, her handwriting still round and uneven, that said simply, "I'm sorry everyone was mean to you." I kept it. I still have it, tucked into the same folder where I keep Owen's report and Renata's signature analysis, because it belongs there too, in its own way. Proof that at least one person in that family had learned to see clearly before she'd even finished growing up. The forged HELOC HELOC became a criminal matter separate from the divorce. The lender's fraud department, once alerted by Vivian and cross-checked against Renata's signature analysis, referred the case to the district attorney's office in New Hanover County. Grant was charged with forgery and uttering a forged instrument in January. His firm, Aldridge Sterling Partners, placed him on administrative leave the same week their own compliance department, not unlike mine, flagged the personal trading losses Owen had traced, the same red line dropping across 14 months that Owen had shown me on his laptop in a small office near the courthouse. He was let go by March. I take no pleasure in saying that the industry he'd spent his career in ran on exactly the kind of scrutiny he'd assumed, wrongly, would never turn its attention toward him. He eventually pled to a reduced charge in exchange for restitution and probation, which meant no trial, which meant I never had to sit in a courtroom and describe any of this to 12 strangers. Part of me had wanted that day in court, wanted the recording played out loud in a room with a judge and a jury and a court reporter typing every word into a permanent record. Vivian talked me through why the plea was still the better outcome. Restitution guaranteed, appeal risk removed. Milo spared the process of possibly being asked about any of it someday by a lawyer he'd never met. I understood the logic. I still felt for a few weeks like I'd been denied a verdict I'd earned. Then I remembered that the sealed custody order was already its own verdict, one that had existed before Grant ever knew I'd stopped believing him, and that was the only ruling I'd actually needed. The custody matter had its formal hearing in North Carolina that same February, conducted mostly through documents and a video appearance from Lisbon, since the emergency order had already been in place for months by then, and Grant's attorney had little left to argue against. Vivian walked the judge through Owen's report, through Renata's signature analysis, through a transcript of the recording that had been authenticated and entered as evidence over an objection from Grant's side that went nowhere. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Carol Whitfield Nash, no relation, an accident of naming that struck me as darkly funny for a single afternoon, made her ruling from the bench in language I've since read so many times I can recite it. Financial deception of this duration and character, she said, particularly when it includes forged legal instruments, constitutes a serious risk factor in assessing a parent's judgment and stability. She granted me primary physical custody permanently, structured visitation for Grant contingent on the resolution of his criminal matter, and noted for the record that the timing of the ultimatum at issue appeared, in her words, orchestrated rather than spontaneous. I wasn't in the room to hear it live. Vivian called me the moment it ended, and I sat on my mother's balcony with the phone against my ear, watching a container ship move slowly down the Tagus, and felt something in my chest finally unclenched that had been clenched, I think, since April of the year before. The house on Kerr Avenue sold in April for $310,000. After the mortgage, the forged HELOC balance that the lender agreed to unwind once Renata's report was entered into the case file, and closing costs, there wasn't much left to split, and what there was, Vivian negotiated into a settlement that accounted for the $48,000 Grant had lost trading and never disclosed. I didn't get rich off that divorce. I got a clean number on a piece of paper, which, after 14 months of numbers that refused to add up, felt like its own kind of luxury. There were smaller logistics that took up more of my energy than I expected. In the months after the confrontation in Alfama, Milo's residency paperwork processed through the same citizenship line my mother had secured for me before I could walk, a preschool near my mother's building that had a waitlist I got onto in December, and a spot open by February, run by a woman named Dona Fatima, who spoke to Milo in slow, patient Portuguese, and switched effortlessly to English when he got frustrated. A lease on a small apartment 2 streets from my mother's, close enough that Milo could walk to her door alone by the time he was 5, far enough that I had my own front door to close at the end of a day. None of it was dramatic. All of it took months, one form and one appointment at a time. The unglamorous work of building an actual life out of a decision I'd made in 11 months of silence. My father sat with me on my mother's small balcony one evening in December, watching the lights come on across the Tagus, and told me he wasn't angry at me for the $10,000, that he understood now why I'd let him believe I already knew. "I just wish you'd told me sooner," he said, and I told him the truth, that I hadn't been ready to be the daughter who admitted her marriage was built on something rotten, not even to the one person who would have believed me instantly. He held my hand and didn't say anything else. Some conversations don't need a response. They just need to happen. Grant wrote to me once, in late January, a long email that took him, by his own admission in the first line, 6 drafts to send. He said he understood now what his silence had cost, that he'd spent his whole life being managed by his mother the way I'd spent 8 years being managed by him, that he wasn't asking me to come back, only asking whether there was any version of the future where he could be a real father to Milo instead of a name on a custody schedule. I read it twice. There were sentences in it that sounded, for the first time in 8 years, like a man actually looking at himself instead of past himself. I believed some of it. I wrote back 3 lines, that our co-parenting arrangement would go through Vivian and the court, that Milo would always know his father wanted to be part of his life if that stayed true, and that I wouldn't be discussing anything about my marriage over email ever again. It wasn't cruelty. It was the first boundary I'd ever set with that family that I didn't immediately soften 10 seconds later. There was a night, sometime in February, when the legal parts had mostly settled into their slow, procedural rhythm and the anger had nowhere left to go, that I sat on the the floor of my mother's guest room going through an old shoebox of photographs I'd shipped over almost as an afterthought. There was a picture of Grant at 28, the year we met, laughing at something off camera before any of this, before I understood what silence from a person you love can cost you over enough years. There was our wedding photo from the garden venue off Airlie Road, Diane's chosen guest list smiling behind us, none of them yet aware of how much of that afternoon's cost would eventually come out of me instead of the mother of the groom. There was a photo of Grant holding Milo for the first time in the hospital, his face open in a way I hadn't seen it be in years by the time I left him. I let myself cry about those photographs for maybe 20 minutes, not for the man in the recording, not for the 4 words that had rearranged everything, but for the version of him I'd married, who may have been real once, in small rooms, before his mother's voice became load-bearing in every decision he made. I mourned too, the version of myself who had believed for so long that patience was a virtue rather than a slow, cumulative surrender. Grief doesn't always arrive for the thing that hurt you. Sometimes it arrives for the thing you'd hoped, right up until the very end, might still be true. I put the shoebox back on the shelf when I was done, not hidden, not thrown away, just put away. The way you'd file a closed account you no longer needed to check, but weren't quite ready to shred. The divorce was finalized in late spring. I was granted primary physical custody, both here and recognized under the original North Carolina order, with Grant permitted supervised visitation, once his legal matters resolved, and structured video calls in the meantime, which he uses inconsistently, which is its own quiet answer to a question I stopped asking out loud. I still work in numbers. I do it remotely now, 3 time zones removed from the office where I first learned to notice when a ledger didn't match its story, consulting for a firm that does exactly the kind of forensic work Owen Reyes does, which feels less like irony and more like the shape my life was always going to take once I stopped ignoring what I was good at. Owen and I still email occasionally. He sent a note when the plea deal was finalized that said only, "Some numbers just need someone patient enough to follow them all the way down." I think about that sentence more than I probably should. Milo is 4 now. He calls the narrow street below my mother's apartment the Loud Street because of the trams, and he started counting in Portuguese as easily as he once counted in Spanish at Ms. Alvarez's daycare, and some evenings I watch him running along the Alfama's uneven stones, and I think about the fact that he will likely never remember a single detail of the dinner that ended his parents' marriage. That feels like a mercy I built for him on purpose at 3 in the morning, with 2 suitcases and a plan 11 months in the making. He talks to Grant on a video call every other Sunday, structured through Vivian's office, and for now those calls are easy and small. Cartoons, a new tooth, a drawing held up to the screen. I don't know what those calls will look like when Milo is old enough to ask harder questions. I've decided not to script an answer in advance. I've had enough of scripts written by other people to last me a lifetime. Diane still lives on Landfall Drive, as far as I know. Brett tells me she stopped bringing up the recording, stopped bringing up any of it, and has started instead telling a version of the story to whoever will listen, where she is simply a grandmother who misses her grandson. I don't correct that story when it reaches me secondhand. I've stopped needing everyone to agree on what happened. I only ever needed a judge to agree, and a judge already had. Months before anyone else in that family knew I'd stopped believing them. I never went back to apologize. I still haven't. Some nights I think about what it would have actually cost any one of them, Grant, Diane, even Brett, before he found his own spine, to say those 2 words to me first, at any point across 8 years, instead of demanding them from me at a dinner table they'd already decided the ending of. I don't think it would have cost them anything at all. I think that's the saddest part of this whole story. Sadder than the money, sadder than the forged signature, that the apology they wanted so badly was never actually the point. Compliance was the point. Being made small enough to sit down and stay there was the point. I think about the man I actually married sometimes. Not the one on the recording. Not the one who said whatever you need, mom into his mother's kitchen 20 minutes before he tried to end my marriage on her instructions. I think about a much younger Grant, 28 years old, laughing at something off camera in a photograph I still own, and I let myself feel the loss of him honestly, without pretending it makes the rest of it untrue. Both things are real. He was gentle with our son. He was also a man who let his mother rehearse the worst night of my life in advance, and then delivered every line exactly as written. I don't need those 2 facts to resolve into a single clean feeling. Some things just stay complicated, and I've stopped needing them not to. I sit down at a table now, and no one gets to decide in advance what will happen to me there. That's not a triumph exactly. It's quieter than triumph. It's just the truth of what an ordinary Thursday can feel like, once you've stopped waiting for a family to notice they've been hurting you, and started instead keeping your own record of exactly what happened, and exactly when, and exactly who said what, until the day arrives when you no longer need anyone else's permission to leave the table for good. Some evenings now I sit on my own small balcony, 2 streets from my mother's, with a glass of Vinho Verde and the sound of the trams below, and I think about seat 14C, about the coffee that didn't spill because my hand didn't shake, about a woman 31,000 feet over black water who already knew, before the plane had even finished its ascent, exactly what she was going to do the moment it landed. I don't think that woman was cold. Whatever Diane decided about the hardness around my eyes the very first time we met, I think she was just finally paying attention to her own life, the way she'd spent a career paying attention to everyone else's numbers. I think about that ultimatum often, the one that was supposed to be the end of me. Say you're sorry or pack your things and leave. I did leave. I never did apologize. Not that night. Not since. What I built instead, 3,000 miles away, in a city my mother handed me the keys to before I was even old enough to understand what a key was for, is a version of my life where nobody gets to hand me that sentence again and expect a different answer. Some nights that's enough. Most nights, if I'm honest, it's more than enough. It's the whole thing.